Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mary Kellogg Jocelyn, and I am the co-owner of the Titanic Museum Attraction. Today it is our honor to present the first generation of a family that was on the Titanic. And at this time, it is our honor also to present her mother's shoes that she wore on the Titanic, and to see this display that we put together for her.
Okay.
Mary,
Hi, guys.
Mary, let's move her over
Yeah,
to.
move her.
No?
Okay. Right here now.
Whoa. Okay. What a beautiful presentation. Thank you. I've seen the shoes once or twice before, but not here, not like this. So it's a little overwhelming.
Tell us when you first saw these shoes.
The very first time, I don't know. They were wrapped in a bag or something in my mother's cedar chest. And I lived most of my life not worrying about the Titanic. It was just something that was part of our history, and it wasn't a big deal until Ballard found the wreck. At that time, I've grown up and I'm living in California. And from time to time, I would come to visit my mom, and somebody would ask her to present something about herself as being a 4-year-old Titanic survivor. And she'd stick the shoes in a plastic bag. And there's a blanket somewhere. She'd stick the blanket there, and she'd go off with her plastic bag to do her presentation. And that's how I came to know the shoes. And I want you to know for absolutely sure that she wore those shoes after she got to the United States. You see the bottom? Oh my goodness sakes. And she would thank you heartily for those lacy handkerchiefs.
How old was she? Tell us how old she was on the Titanic.
On the Titanic, she was 4. As a matter of fact, her birthday is April 8th. So she was traveling from Zurich, where she was born, through Europe to Southampton. Yeah, I don't know, she doesn't, oh, by the way, we have no stories because she had suffered traumatic amnesia. So her entire life, especially during the last 7 years of her life, when she'd give presentations, she would always start the same way. I'm so sorry. I can't tell you anything because I can't remember anything. And then she would talk with all the information she had gleaned from others about her life, et cetera, because it came, I always see in my mom's mind a board with little bits of information that made a collage, and from there she spoke and told a story. And the family, do you want me to continue? How far do you want me to go?
Go.
Okay. Okay. What?
Just talk right here.
All right, you're the boss. So they were at St. Vincent's Hospital. This photograph, we never knew about this photograph. It's in a book called Titanic, God Speaks to Nations, page 94, I think it is. You open the book, page 94, and there's a photograph of 2 women and 3 children, the Sandstrom family and the Kinks. My family is the Kinks, K-I-N-K. And you can see her shoes right there. And that was in front of St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City. And they had to stay there until there was some legal thing about being released. And then they went on by train to Wisconsin, to Milwaukee, where my grandfather had relatives. And that's where she lived her life. Her father and mother were together until she was about 10. They were divorced. And my grandfather, Anton Kink, stayed on the farm, and my grandmother took my mom, and were domestic helpers in local rich people's homes. You know, first class, third class. So she lived her life in the life, and she communicated with her father, who left in 1920 to go back to Europe after World War I. And he remarried. He had a son with his second wife, and he has a little bit of gypsy blood, which is probably why I'm in California, right? And he decided to go to Brazil. So for those of you who've looked at the history and the migrations, it's like, okay, that makes sense, because he was from Austria, traveled to Switzerland. She's from Germany, took the train to Zurich, and that's where they met. Okay, and so after the Titanic sunk, my grandfather continued his gypsy ways and returned, and we never knew what happened to him. My mother never, because they communicated by letters about 10 years, my mother and my grandfather, and then there was silence. And my mother always says the silence was probably due to, they had revolutions down there in South America, she used to say. And so they were cut off. So when my mother died in 1992, she still had no idea what happened to her father and her stepmother and her half-brother. And that grieved her a great deal. My mother was active with the various Titanic societies, and in 1992, a young Titanic scholar met her in Boston and he's from Zurich, and he brought her a picture book of all the houses that she lived in for the first 4 years of her life, because in Switzerland, they keep track of that stuff. So she looked at those pictures, and you have to understand at that point, she had no memory. My mother taught herself to yodel. That's how much she wanted to go back to Switzerland. She looked at those pictures like if she could look at them hard enough, she could remember. It was a beautiful moment to see that. That young man, who was 19 at the time, I have since about that time, in the early 90s, he's a Titanic scholar, you may know him, Gunter Babler. And after my mother died, I tracked with him about the Titanic, which is why I'm here. He's dragged me into the ship. Which I'm grateful for, it's wonderful. And when I was not very good to him in the beginning. I didn't communicate. I was really grieving my mother, and my eldest sister died right afterwards, so life was kind of falling apart. But later on in the 90s, after people were taking pieces off the debris field, and the big piece, which is now of the ship, which is now in Las Vegas, that was touring. And he was curious. He knew that there were letters. He never saw the letters between my grandfather and my mom. He had no idea what was going on, what happened to them. But he got a wild hair, and he took the picture, half the picture, that on page 94, and had it published in the European newspapers with some kind of thing like, does anyone know these people? Well, it turns out that the Kink family, before World War II completely blew up, they were kind of pushed out of Brazil. They were not dead. They were right there on the southern end of Brazil in cattle country and thriving. but they got pushed out of Brazil because Brazil was on the other side. So that started my lifelong dream of finding my grandfather. But I was too busy with my own life yet. I wanted it to happen before my mom died, but it didn't. She died in '92, and we found out what happened to her family, her father and her half-brother. We're in Graz, Austria. There they were, back where they started, where he started. What a surprise. And so then Günther arranged for me to go visit, and I met my family.
Today, we're able to honor your mother, who was 4 years old, on the Titanic.
4 years.
And it is our honor to display and tell her story. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for being interested. And it's really, really great. I just wanted to point out to you, because my mother was a girl. You know that, mothers are girls. So my haploid self was on the Titanic too.
Anyway, thank you.
What do you think of when you see these shoes?
I think about how worn they were on the bottom. My family came with a few things, which went down with the Titanic, including her aunt and uncle, my grandfather's younger brother and sister. But I think about how hard they had it. I think that's what I think about. I think about the hard Scrabble times that they had beginning here in 1912. You can think about, if you can think about it. Remember, it was only a few years later we had the flu, and lots of people died. We had World War I. It was a tumultuous time, and I think of the shoes and I think of the hard time. That's what I think about. But I also know the woman who grew into the mom that she was to me.
Will you share the first time you saw these shoes? How old were you? And share with us the first
No clue,
time.
my friend. It was just there in the trunk, in the cedar chest. Occasionally that chest would open and she'd take some things out of the chest, and those were her shoes, and I didn't care. I mean, the passion of the Titanic didn't erupt until Ballard found the wreck on the bottom. And then everyone started talking about the Titanic. And then we in our family are going, oh yeah, huh. We took it for granted. It's just what is. So now I get to see the shoes more than I ever would, because from time to time I follow them wherever they are and go to visit my mom's shoes. And in my mind, I'm building a biography of my mom. Not just when she was 4, but throughout her life, till she was 84. She lived 80 years after the Titanic sank.
What are the emotions you're feeling looking at these shoes?
Strong. First of all, it's beautifully displayed. I've seen them in lots of venues, and this is sweet. This is really sweet. The lacy handkerchief makes the contrast really nice. I think about her, I can see her going, oh, I'm making a big deal about it. And so that's pretty much what comes up in my mind, is images of her. And one time before they were part of any traveling, these have been on the road and have traveled more than my mom did, and she would be annoyed about that. But I remember when she was traveling to places and she had them in her plastic bag, she'd take them out the plastic bag, she'd put it on the table. I mean, I can't even touch these shoes, right? So, because they're in here. She'd take them out and put them on the table, and people would go, oh, wow. And then she'd pick up a shoe and say, here, do you want to touch it? She says, yeah, the bottom was on the Titanic. That was on the Titanic. And so I think about those stories and those situations, and it makes me smile.
Can you share, how do you think it's important to share the history of Titanic? Particularly, your family's directly involved. Obviously, thousands, millions of people are interested.
It's overwhelming, first of all, that I feel kind of like my mom, of like, oh man. I mean, you guys are all just Titanic nuts as far as she's concerned. And she always meant that lovingly. And when people would come up to her and start asking questions, and she'd say, oh, you're another Titanic nut. And so there's a sort of a discomfort, essential discomfort of, you're making a lot, I mean, I have a lot of lights on me right now, and I'm not, I mean, maybe I act out from time to time, but this is like big, and she was that way too, in a lot of ways. But what's really special to me is to be able to tell the story, and to tell the story in the context of history as much as possible. Because we're living history in a similar fashion now. I mean, we had just had our plague. She had, in 1919, there was another one. We've had 2 major wars since then. And look at all the people, where they came from. And we are just beginning to actually apprehend who was on the ship. I mean, we only learned about the 8 Chinese a few years ago. So there's this, it's exciting to say, look at who we are. You know, we're maybe warring and killing each other, that keeps going on. But to me, this is a story of humanity, and humanity reaching out to better themselves. Yeah, that's what I like to talk about.
Can you express, so the shoes are in the children's gallery, the importance of that, the little ones coming through this museum, which is many, many, many kids. What do you think the kids would realize when they see these shoes?
Well, I feel we're lucky that we see the shoes, and we also see the image of the little girl with her hair and pigtails and holding a little doll, which if they're here in the Ozarks, it'd be a pig, right? One of those stuffed pigs. They can relate to that, and they can imagine in their mind what that might have been like. And that's a great thing. Gunter, my good friend who was interested in the Titanic from the beginning, since he was 10 years old or something, 10. And he wanted to know, he asked his teacher, when they told the story of the Titanic, he asked his teacher, well, why did they all have to die? Why didn't they just clamber up onto the iceberg? And then they wouldn't drown. I don't know if I'm telling it right, and he would be annoyed, but that's how I tell it. And so the teacher didn't give him an answer. The teacher said, why don't you research that? Look at how many things, when the kids come here, and all the information that is here, they get the information, they want to know more, and that is something that gets stimulated. And that pleases me. I mean, I get very excited. Sometimes I'll sneak up by a kid and I'll watch them and listen to their question. I ask them questions. And I like it.
So when the shoes first got in the hands of a conservator or whatever, what sort of condition were they in? Had they deteriorated very much?
You see how they came out of the trunk?
Oh, they haven't been like restored or?
Nope.
Wow.
They've been conserved insofar as nobody messes with them, they wear gloves, no, they have not been restored. As a matter of fact, you will notice that the shoestrings, one's brown and one's not brown. What's the other one?
So as a museum professional, that's okay? Or a curator? Oh, a curator. So there's not gonna be deterioration?
Oh, sure.
Sure, over time, but leather is very, very hardy. It's very hardy in the bottom of the ocean. But I think you think of conservative when they're put in conditions like when they're brought up from the bottom of the ocean that have been soaked in water, where they need to conserve, they need to take the salt out of it. The salt would deteriorate them. But in this case, these have not been exposed to that, so they're fine.
What's been the past since your mother died of the shoes?
The path? Well, she grew out of them.
Since she died, where have the shoes gone from where to
Oh,
where?
I didn't understand your
And like
sentence.
who owns them now? Do you own them now? Oh, you own them.
Well, the family owns it, but yeah, and yeah. And like I said, they spent most of this time since she was 4 in a trunk. Oh, well, I don't know how long she was.
So you're generous to let lots of people see them.
You know what? I can put them in a plastic bag and put them in a trunk, but what's the use of that? That's not good. And somewhere there's also a blanket, and she was wrapped in a blanket, and that that blanket really makes me smile a lot, because I can see my grandma. I knew my grandma. I can see my grandma wrapping her in the blanket and holding her. And when people say that she had traumatic amnesia, sometimes I say, no, she was probably deprived of oxygen from my grandmother holding on to her. You know, and I make a joke that way, because when my grandmother would hug me, my bones would crunch, and she grabbed my, that's why this part of my face is more wrinkled. But I know my grandma as a fierce person and a hardworking person. And she used to, what was your question? I don't think I was going down another path. You're asking me what I was thinking, and boy, am I thinking now. Ask me a question. Get me back onto a path.
Any other questions? Do you believe the grandparents' divorce was that heavily influenced by the trauma of the sinking of the ship?
My mother says that's so. She believes it's so. These days, we would want everyone to talk about it, because PTSD gets worse and worse when it's buried. And they didn't talk about it. My grandmother was from Germany, from the Ensborg, and it's in the Stuttgart area. I don't know if you know the southern part. It's a hard scrabble area at that time. And when I visited that area, I was with these nuns, and one of them started to sing a song about people who come from where my grandmother comes from. And I wish I could, someday I'll learn it, it's in German. But basically, people who come from that part of the world live to work and work to live. That's what they do, boom, boom, boom. My grandfather was from Austria. He had a little bit different personality. And I've read some of his letters, and I know him a little bit from that. And so I think that the trauma calcified them in their differences. You know, it made them more rigid. And no, whatever, you know, things happen.
Can you share your thoughts? Here you are in the heartland of the country, in the middle of the country, in the town of Branson, and here's this world-class museum tucked away in the Ozark Hills. Is this your first trip to Branson?
Yeah.
Tell us how you feel about Branson and this museum.
Well, first of all, I was at Pigeon Forge before. Gabe, my grandson, was also with me then. So I knew a little bit about the organization and the quality of the organization. I know Pigeon Forge because Dolly was there, and and I didn't think much about where I really was in the United States. But when we were coming in today, I realized where we were, and we're in the bloody Ozarks. And all kinds of stuff changed in my head. I said, God, United States of America and the Ozarks. You know, I've been to lots of places, but I haven't been here. And now I want to come back here. And not only that, because of how we were treated, how I've been treated, I feel I could walk in the door and be home here. And that's how it is for me now. It's a big bright light in the map. Wyoming is just a straight line. Ozarks is fecund and rich and has lots of ticks.
Yes, yes, they do.
And lots of immigrants. I mean, the Titanic obviously filled with immigrants. Here we are in the center of the country with lots of immigrant stories.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, just any book you pick up about the settling of the United States by people who came from Europe, you look around and that's what we have. I don't know, no, I'm not gonna go there. But yeah, it's all a story of immigrants. And now, and all the time, every decade passes, we have another set of faces to put in it. That's why the six is such an important story. Do you know about the six, y'all? It's there were 8 Chinese, 6 of them survived. The fact that 6 Chinese survived was controversial, number one, because the attitude toward Asians in the United States was not favorable. I did that well, didn't I? And they disappeared until somebody started to research, started to pull. You look in the names of the passengers, and if you can read them and understand them, what does that say? Suddenly somebody gets curious and they pull at a thread, and all of a sudden now, there's this 6 Chinese and a lot of information about them. I was in New York. Shoes and I were in New York just a few months ago. And after I talked like I'm talking here now, somebody came up to me and was kind of stalking me as I was walking, came up to me, and it was Stephen Schwanker. Did I say that right? He said who he was, and I was very excited because a few years earlier, I think I don't remember what year it was, a few years back, I was in China and I had heard about the 6, and I had heard that Stephen's companion in this research was there, and I tried to hook up with them in China, and we didn't make it. So here I'm back in New York. Stephen's pulling on my sleeve, and we shake, and he and I start talking about the 6, and about the fact that he didn't know that I was existed, that I was a direct descendant of a survivor, because he thought that the son of one of the 6 was the only. He didn't know. He didn't know that there's still a couple of us who are direct descendants. So I was so excited because here was one of the 6 kids, like me, survivor kid. And I said, oh, where does he live? Where is he? Well, he's in Janesville, Wisconsin. Well, after I went to New York, I went to Wisconsin to visit family there. But first, I went to Janesville to meet. And so here's a whole thing that just happened. In 2023, and we started to talk a lot about what we're talking about here. You know, what do we know? How do we know it? How do you feel about it? And we agreed that how we feel about it changes all the time. Because the story changes all the time. Okay? Anyway, that's it.
Sounds like you got the wanderlust gene from Grandpa.
That's what I said. I'm part gypsy, part Neanderthal. 23andMe told me.
Joan, now that you've spent a couple days at the museum, what do you think of this museum, and what do you think of this as a home for those shoes?
No, they don't stay here.
You taking them home today?
No.
What do you think of the museum?
I love the museum. I really do. We had a little conversation about that at dinner last night, and this does feel more intimate than Pigeon Forge. I like it. I like the feel of it. Yeah, it's a lovely museum. But you know, you guys, I've been treated like a queen, and I'm really a steerage girl. So this is a big change for me, to get all this love.